Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which, as we all know, is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that one or two will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. Season 4 promises to be the best one yet, and I know it's been a long time coming, so thank you for your patience. The reason for the delay is that I've been writing books, researching new projects such as this podcast, and planning the Serve It Forth Food History Festival, which took place in October, as well as winning a Fortnum & Mason Food and Drink Award for this podcast. I do have some more news about a special Serve It Forth event taking place in a few weeks, so stay tuned until the end to find out more. Right, that's my apologies made, so without any further ado, let's get cracking with episode 1. In June 2011, Winona LeDuc, an Anishinaabe environmental activist, gave a TEDx talk entitled Seeds of Our Ancestors, Seeds of Life. LeDuc, who lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, explained to the audience the importance of wild rice to the Anishinaabe people. She began with these words: "Food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots, and indeed, that is how we consider food. Food has a culture, it has history, it has stories, it has relationships that tie us to our food. Food is more than something you just buy at the store." LeDuc had been campaigning for decades to raise awareness of the issues of climate change, renewable energy and environmental injustice which affect Indigenous communities, and is the founder of the White Earth Land Recovery Project, where she works to protect Indigenous plants and heritage foods from patenting and genetic engineering. You're probably familiar with the concept of wild rice, those dramatically black needle-like grains that contrast so wonderfully with commercially cultivated white rice. It's readily available to buy in British health food stores and supermarkets, as I'm sure it is in other nations across the globe. But what you may not be familiar with is Manoomin, the hand-harvested, truly wild rice that grows in the lakes and rivers of the Great Lakes region in the USA and Canada. It is an important part of the Anishinaabe culture as a traditional food with spiritual and economic significance to many communities. But this food and aspect of the Anishinaabe way of life is under threat, as the wild rice habitat is pillaged by multinational energy companies, laying their gas and oil pipelines and displacing local communities. It is also suffering from the effects of climate change. As Native American Heritage Month draws to a close, I wanted to find out more about Manoomin and its importance to the Anishinaabe people. I'm joined by Cass Gardiner, an Anishinaabe Algonquin filmmaker, curator and writer from the Kebaowek First Nation. Welcome to the podcast, Cass.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's really nice to have you here. Before we get into discussing Manoomin further, can you tell me a bit more about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Cass Gardiner. I'm Anishinaabe and Algonquin from Kebaowek First Nation in what we now call Canada in the province of Quebec. And for the last 13, now maybe 14 years, I've been working as a filmmaker, a writer, and also just an enthusiast about learning about my culture through the specific lens of food and ecology and environmental kind of practices. Through my own kind of research and through these films that I work on, I really get to kind of investigate and relearn a lot of these old ancient practices that are still being practiced today. And there's this huge native food revitalization kind of movement that's been building over the last 10 years that I just feel very grateful to be a part of.
Can you tell us a little bit about the origin story about how the Anishinaabe came to settle in the place where the food grows upon the water? How long do we think you've been in this area?
Sure. So the Anishinaabe are a group of people. So we were a tribal nation in, before the border that separated Canada and the U.S. It would have been in like the northeast of the continent of North America. And we were also a nation that was made up of a bunch of different groups of, smaller kind of tribes. And the story goes that we were in the area of what would now presently be called like Maine. And we received a prophecy that said that it was time for us to migrate west, and we were not to stop until we saw a place where the food grew on the water. And so our people, thousands of years ago, started this migration from the East Coast, and they traveled to what we now call the Great Lakes area. And in that region, there is a food that is very specific to only that place in the entire world, and it's called Manoomin, or in English, it's known as wild rice, which is not actually rice, it's a seed. Which is interesting. And anyway, so when they discovered that, that's when they knew this is the place that we should settle. And so the Anishinaabe have been there for thousands of years cultivating and stewarding that area and the Manoomin.
What spiritual significance does Manoomin have to the Anishinaabe? And are there any deities or rituals associated with the rice or its harvesting?
So Manoomin is really sacred and an important food for the Anishinaabe, first because it's really a staple food. The wild rice, as I mentioned with the prophecy, is something that is very tied to like our identity. And it's also a bit of a laborious practice, like a lot of our traditional food systems. I think it's interesting also because Indigenous food practices and Indigenous culture in general existed before capitalism existed, and our time was, kind of every minute of our day is like assigned to a value of like labor and making, like kind of money for other people. And I always think it's interesting to kind of relearn these practices because they really force you to kind of slow down and be very present, and you have to really be aware and look around at the seasons and see how things are changing because, our foods, when you're living off the land in this like very intense way, when the seasons change, regardless of what's happening, you have to go out and you have to harvest the manoomin or, the black walnuts or whatever, because, there's like a finite time for that. And in the fall, the timing is for the wild rice. There's even, I do not remember the name off the top of my head, but we even have one of the full moons that's called the wild rice moon when you translate it, because that moon is usually in the season where it's like, oh, now you have to start harvesting the wild rice. And so wild rice, the harvesting practice of it is, it's actually kind of like a reed that grows. It's not kind of, it is a reed that grows out of the water. And people will take these canoes traditionally, and they're still used today, canoes actually. So you'll go with your canoe, and there's usually two people. There's one person that's kind of steering and rowing the canoe, and then another person has these two knockers, which are these big sticks. And with one stick, you kind of, I'm like making the gesture with my hand, but for those that can't see, you have one hand and with one knocker that's kind of gently pulling the reed down. And then with the other hand and the other knocker, you knock on the reed and you're kind of gently tapping, and then the seeds will fall out into the canoe. And then you put the reed back. You kind of let the reed spring back upright. And so therefore, it's really cool because it's a regenerative food practice. You're not like taking the reed out. You can, that same reed will produce rice over the course of the season, and then you let it kind of continue to grow. So you, in theory, will have a lot of rice in the future, and it's a continuously growing thing. And the rice, when it's ready, will knock out when you knock it. So they go around and you're knocking over and over again until your canoe is pretty full with the wild rice. And then once that's done, you go to shore. And then there's a few other processes to make the wild rice, kind of this delicacy that we know and love. So people will put it in these big baskets, and traditionally, and still today even, you put on moccasins, which are very soft and supple, and you dance on the wild rice. And so when you're dancing with your moccasins on it, it's separating the hull from the seed from the hull. And then you kind of can sift after that the seed away. And then they have these big sort of like pots, and they will roast those. So real Manoomin or wild rice is slightly toasted, and it just makes it such an amazing, nutty, rich flavor that is really hard to kind of replicate in another way. And that's also one of the ways you'll know that you're having like authentic wild rice, is if it's like slightly toasted. And so after it's been toasted and cooled, that's when the wild rice is ready to eat. To your question about, what is the kind of spiritual importance of it, it is an incredibly nutritious and nutrient dense food that, back in, pre-contact times when, you were living off the land and nutrition was a really important thing. Wild rice is a carb, so it's something that's going to give you energy. It's going to sustain you for long periods of time. But like many of our traditional foods, it's actually a blood sugar stabilizing carb. So it's not going to spike your blood sugar. It's going to give you like that like sort of even energy that you need throughout the day. And it's super nutrient dense. It has a lot of vitamins and minerals. So in a time where those things were, important, wild rice was just this huge staple that was also something that we would trade with. And it was something that people knew, you're going to visit the Anishinaabe, you're going to get your wild rice. And so it's something that we took a lot of pride in traditionally back then and still today. And it's, it's something that's very specific to the area too. It's very unique.
From how you've described the harvesting, I'm guessing there's no shortcuts. You can't mechanize this in any way. That's why one of the reasons it's remained the way it has all these centuries.
I know that you can buy wild rice in the store. I'm using air quotes to say wild rice.
Well, yes.
Because it's not, wild rice really is found in this one area, and it's grown in this very specific way and harvested in this specific way. And I know that there's big rice companies like Lunenburg and other companies that have sort of tried to replicate this in a patty setting, how you would traditionally make rice. But it is, again, it's not the same, because when you're doing like mechanization with like the way that commercial rice is made, they do take the whole plant out and, harvest the rice that way. And as I mentioned with Manoomin, you're kind of leaving it to continue to grow and generate. Also, the wild rice, as I mentioned, it's a seed, and the real wild rice looks very different than the kind that you buy in like the blends or when you can buy them from commercial. They're shorter grain, and wild rice is actually extremely long and very thin and very dark. So that's kind of another way you can tell if you're getting authentic wild rice or not.
We get wild rice in the UK. You can go into a supermarket and buy wild rice, but I've only seen pictures of Manoomin online. I already know that the wild rice I can buy in my supermarket is obviously nothing like the wild rice that you guys have. But I even Googled Californian wild rice. I'm guessing that, again, isn't the same at all.
Yeah, technically wild rice can only come from the Great Lakes region and has to be harvested in a specific way. I know there's a lot of tribes, including like Winona Leduc and a lot of nations that are in the Great Lakes, like Red Lake First Nation. They have a huge sale of wild rice. That's actually where I get my wild rice from. I'll order it online from them. And I know that they've been trying to kind of argue for like copyright and sort of patenting, because these big companies and corporations will kind of make and market something that's called wild rice, but it is a completely different food altogether. It's not wild rice. So yeah, I would be curious what the wild rice looks like that they have in the UK. I was in France and I saw a pretty legit actually looking wild rice, and it said it came from a native community, but I couldn't find any more information. I tried to dig a little to see like where they were getting their source from, but
I mean, I think there's a multitude of rices in Europe that are perhaps labelled as wild rice, but aren't Manoomin for sure. They're different types of wild rice, shall we say.
Well, even in the US, I would say too, it's very difficult to find wild rice. Like you won't find traditional wild rice on the shelves in the supermarket in the US either.
Yeah.
I have to order mine online specially, and that's because I'm someone who knows and is like in the know about these kinds of things. But I think the general population doesn't know that either, even in the US where it's like indigenous too.
Obviously, it's a wild product, so it's at the mercy of the elements. So yields must fluctuate year on year. Do we have any idea how much was produced in the past compared to perhaps today, with the global warming and climate change and all these factors that are at play now?
I'm not sure about the numbers of like how much was produced like pre-contact or even like 100 years ago versus today. I do think, however, it's more man-made versus environmental factors that affect the wild rice, because a lot of the issues with wild rice is the privatization of land, the privatization of, bodies of water, and the ability for indigenous peoples to like go out and harvest the wild rice. Also, pollution is a huge issue because wild rice is, it's a grain it's a seed that's growing in the water. So if the water is contaminated, that's clearly where, it's going to suck up whatever environmental contaminants are there. So you do have to kind of make sure that where you're harvesting it from is clean. But I would say, generally speaking, it's the lack of access to lands and also communities' lack of resources to be able to, take a week or two off and do the wild rice traditions that are required, which, not everybody today could afford to do that either. It's quite a luxury to be able to do these practices, really, unfortunately. But I have seen some communities do what they call wild rice camps, which is cool, where they'll do like a weekend or like they'll have like 3 or 4 days set aside, and people will take off work and they'll go and they'll have feasting, and people will travel from kind of all over. Even if people aren't Anishinaabe and it's not part of their practice, they want to learn about it, or they want to be in community with other indigenous people. And that way too, it's a lot of, many hands make light work. So you can harvest these big volumes of wild rice and you can have your reserves and pantries filled for, the next year until the Manoomin's ready to harvest again. So I do like seeing that these things are coming back, and I like the creative ways that people are finding, workarounds to the fact that it's, the world has changed and the way that we harvest wild rice has not. So.
Is it gendered in any way, the harvesting, or has it been in the past? Maybe not so much now. I get that now it's a whole community thing, but were there distinct roles for men and women, or was it something that was done exclusively by women, for example, or men?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure about that. Traditionally, there's not so much of a gender divide. I would assume it's probably the women would dance on it and the men might harvest it with the reeds. But I think people are just excited when people are excited about learning these things. And so people are like, anyone that wants to do it, feel free. We're happy as long as, people are learning this so that these cultural traditions survive and get passed down for another generation. I think we can't afford to be picky. It's interesting because like when speaking about Indigenous practices and gender, it's also tricky, or, we have to think about the context really matters, because gender constructs that we know today were not applicable in Native communities and in like Indigenous ontologies. And for example, the Anishinaabe were a matrilineal society. So the women were they were the heads of governing. They were making most of the decisions. If you had a child, your lineage would be passed on through the mother, and the man would move his stuff into the woman's family's, house, and that's where they lived. So women had a lot of power. And, when you're living off the land too, it just comes down to sometimes like this task is easier and accomplished faster by a man doing it because they have more brute force, or they could, have the more strength to do certain things. But strength and positionality of like tasks wasn't necessarily an indicator of the fact that they were held in like higher regard in the community, which I just think is an interesting thing. I always have to, as someone who, grew up in the modern, our modern society, I sometimes see gendered things, or like the fact that women have to wear ribbon skirts for certain ceremonies, and I sort of cringe at that. And then I have to sort of remind myself of these, things.
So the roasting must be quite a precarious process. I'm making a comparison to how saffron used to be processed in Britain back in the days when we had a saffron industry, and they used to roast it over a kiln. And it was literally, you had to turn these, they called them saffron cakes, every 30 minutes. And that was, we're talking about gender, that was a lady's job. But it was, if you didn't get it right, you could entirely ruin a crop or, a harvest. Is that the same? Maybe not today, but was that the same in the past with Manoomin?
I know they use drums today. They probably would have used a basket, and then you had to like work very quickly. I know, for example, in California, they actually would cook in these very delicate, like natural fiber baskets, and you just had to like stir constantly. And if you burned it, that was like, kind of like they
Bad.
wouldn't let you do that again.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let you do that again. They were like, all right, I mean, the thing that I find interesting about Indigenous communities too, like historically, is that we were always happy to adopt a new technology if it made our lives easier. Like we were the OG people who would be like, oh, you have metal? That's good. Okay, let's use that. Like we don't need to use these baskets anymore. Like I don't think people today, because we're revitalizing these practices just so that we can like remember them and have them and feel this connection to our ancestors. And because there's that rupture in culture and history, I think a lot of people, especially like, elders, feel it's really important to kind of adhere strictly to tradition and try to go back and kind of relearn these practices, even if they're, maybe not as efficient, I would say. But there's just so much knowledge and information that we have about our ancestors that, when they were trading with settlers and they were like, oh, we have ribbons. Now we don't have to do beadwork on our skirts. That's going to save us a lot of time. Oh, there's like metal pots. That's going to make this work so much faster. Like we were very quick to adopt new technologies as they came. So yeah, these new metal drums are used a lot, but it probably would have been a basket and you would have had to like very quickly toast things.
So you've had this centuries of, I'm going to say cultivating Manoomin, because effectively you work, although it's wild, it is being cultivated in a sense. And then the Europeans come along. What impact did that have?
So in the beginning, early trade relations and, the Hudson Bay Company, these like, fur traders coming first into that area of North America, mostly French, actually, and some British. It wasn't necessarily a negative interaction at first. It wasn't really until the United States kind of gained its independence from Great Britain, and the sort of quest for taking land and designating, putting borders up, that the Anishinaabe really started to kind of see big changes with their access to this food, which is, of course, inherently tied to the access to the land. And it was sort of not like just this one big event that happened, but this slow sort of chipping away over time. And there were a few strategies that the British and then the colonists of, this newly formed country, the United States of America, sort of practiced, where they would get them to kind of sign treaties. And one of the big kind of differences was the understanding of sort of how land is managed and this idea of borders, which was a foreign concept in the sense that these are very strict borders. This is like a space that you cannot enter because I own this land. Whereas land management and kind of, sort of like ownership, quote unquote, in an indigenous sense would have been a very flexible border, because ultimately, again, if you're living off the land, you may need to go to another area because that's where the herds that, the deer are moving. And so you would move there, and it wouldn't be, oh, well, this is like this person's land, so even though the deer are here, I can't go there. So like the idea of land was very flexible, and it was very pragmatic, and it was very based on, well, this is how the seasons are changing, and this is where our food sources and our resources are moving. So we too will move with them, and then we'll move back. And there was this kind of idea, I think, that existed in Indigenous governance and politics, where it was, when you were treating with someone else, it was an ongoing conversation. There was never like a finiteness where when they dealt with the British, there was this issue where they would be signing treaties and thinking, well, this is like the beginning of this conversation, relationship that we're going to have. And we're going to have that for years and decades to come. And we will, when something happens, we will talk about it. And it's flexible and we can change. And of course, as we know, the British colonists were very like, you sign this paper that says we own this thing and now that's it. And you can never come back to that. And this is like a finite sort of decision that has been made. So that was one kind of strategy that, didn't work out for the Anishinaabe, where they were losing their land that way. Another practice they would do is actually creating debt so that they could then say to the native people, well, you actually owe us all this money, so instead of paying us back, why don't you just give us 500 acres of your land? So that is another tactic that the British did. They had to create debt because that didn't exist. So they would set up these stores and these kind of general stores and these native sort of markets where they would be able to buy food products, but also they'd be able to buy, pots and cloth and matches and things that they had come to sort of use and rely on to make their life easier, not realizing that that was kind of a debt trap that was being set for them. And then when they couldn't pay, they would give up their land that way. So that's how the Anishinaabe lost a lot of access to lakefront sort of property, which we would say now. But yeah, so access to being able to be on the water and be able to harvest Manoomin.
Because I'm guessing the colonists wanted access to that water as well, because water's a vital resource. There is no life without water. I can imagine that occurred quite early on. So what effect did the loss of these traditional foods, or access to these traditional foods, have on the First Nations people?
Well, there was huge effects to having loss of access to our traditional foods. The first one, as we kind of touched upon, is just this kind of spiritual sense of, your identity. Like, you are someone, as Indigenous people, we think of ourselves as stewards of the land. This is, in our kind of understanding of our purpose in life, it's that we're here on this earth for a limited amount of time to take care of its resources and make sure that they are, not only surviving, but thriving, and that we're leaving the land, as well as we found it, if not better, for the next 7 generations. I know that's something that a lot of people know, this idea of, you take care of something for the next 7 generations. And so the loss of that would be extremely profound, because not only are you not able to kind of in a way, live out your purpose, but also you're seeing your land that you've cared for, there's evidence to show hundreds of thousands of years Indigenous people have been in North America. And you're seeing that land and all of the plants and all of the waterways totally being, desecrated in a lot of ways to make way for cattle and livestock and, kind of European ways of farming practices. So that was a very emotional, spiritual rupture that we experienced. Another effect of being taken away from our traditional lands and our foods was that our health suffered and still does suffer today. When we were signing these treaties, a lot of the stipulations in the treaties was not only giving the land to the settlers or these, companies, but it was also that they would provide a small parcel of land, which we now have come to know as reservations. These reservations would have been on the land that was the least desirable, the land that wasn't going to yield well for agriculture and didn't have a lot that was growing on it. And then they also would put these general stores, and they were filled with white flour, white sugar, salt, lard, and that was kind of it. Maybe some canned foods, but they were very, compared to this diet that our ancestors were used to having, where it's wild fish and berries, and you're having wild rice, and you're having venison, you're having all of these diverse food groups that are very nutritionally dense, and now you're just eating white sugar, white flour, kind of making do with what you have. So obviously people's health really suffered, and despite the small percentage of the population we make up, we have the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes as a result of that. And that's why it's really important, too, that we want to sort of reclaim our traditions, not just for the fact that it gives us a sense of belonging and sense of self and community, but also it literally helps us to, stay alive.
Yeah. You touched on earlier one of the biggest threats to Manoomin production, and that's pollution, which I understand comes largely from the development of these pipelines that the US and Canadian governments have installed across vast swathes to connect all these pipelines to basically shift gas and oil from one part of the country to another. When did it start? Do we know? And what sort of impact has it had in that time?
The pipeline is a huge problem for the wild rice and also the communities that are in the Great Lakes area, because as we know, fracking and these pipelines really use a lot of water. And then the water that they produce is extremely polluted, and it will take, a long time to kind of become clean again, if it ever does. And in the meantime, it's affecting the environment around it and our food source, which is growing on the water. So these pipelines have been heavily contested by Indigenous communities, and there's activists like Winona LaDuke, who is kind of a scholar and expert on wild rice. She's created these wild rice camps and revitalization practices in her own communities and written books. One of her books about it is how I first, when I was studying in school, learned about the issues with Enbridge and these pipelines. And it's something that's just a continued threat, because these are obviously these billion-dollar industries that have a lot of money that they are set out to make and want to continue to make. And, we have these little Native communities that are on the front lines, literally, protesting them, preventing and blocking their trucks from coming in, and really doing the boots on the ground kind of grassroots organizing to protect our resources, which is incredible considering they're, a small but mighty group of people.
Yeah, Winona LaDuke wrote a book called The Water Protectors in 2020, and I've read sections of it, and it's quite horrific. Some of the stuff she talks about. I mean, I think we can safely say I live in a very small island nation. So for us, when we think of oil spills, we think predominantly of things happening at sea, because obviously our own oil industry is based predominantly in the North Sea. So oil spills for us are like tankers crashing, an issue with the pipelines in the ocean, not on land. she describes some of the oil spills that have occurred and leakages that have occurred. Leakages is too mild a way of putting it. I mean, they're, even as she says, a small leak can be catastrophic, can't it?
Yeah, it is. It's very disheartening because these ecosystems, as we know, are so fragile. So even, like one spill, as we may say, it can be actually a huge amount of this oil and these pollutants that are just in the environment. And, it takes a second for them to contaminate. And then it takes decades, if not centuries, for that land and that water to heal. So it's just... Yeah, I feel like it's hard to comprehend sometimes, like the scale, and it's obviously hidden, like it's obfuscated from us, because I think if people did know the scale and saw those impacts for themselves, there would be outrage.
I mean, I think we perhaps don't hear about it quite so readily over here in Europe. I could be wrong. I mean, there may be some of my listeners that will disagree with that statement, but it was the first time I'd heard about it, that the extent of it anyway, was when I read LeDuc's book. So, I think it's something that needs to be, the awareness of it needs to be raised.
I was going to say Indigenous peoples all over, I feel like, have this sort of, we're always like a bit of the canary in the coal mine or something, because we're so tied to the remaining sort of wild, quote unquote. I actually don't really like that word wild, because the land has been stewarded by Native peoples, and that's why it's been so prolific and, kind of beautiful. But, it's like, I forget what the statistic is, but I think it's like for the small percentage that Indigenous people occupy in the world, it's like the sort of the forest, the rainforest, these natural like preserves that are becoming more and more rare, and they're in the stewardship of those places. And these, pipelines and oil drilling and all these, deforestation practices, the Indigenous peoples are the people on the ground who are seeing those effects first and foremost. And so that's why I like to shout from the rooftop that like Indigenous issues affect everybody, because it's kind of like what's happening to Indigenous people will eventually happen to, everybody. It's just we're kind of the people who are on the front lines experiencing it first and foremost. So I'm really happy that, people like Winona LeDuc are writing books so that, people in England are understanding these, what's happening and the ramifications of it.
And on top of this, all as part of a consequence of these developments, these multinational, huge companies that are building pipelines and, well, basically encouraging us to use fossil fuels, we've got the effects of climate change. What impact has that had on the Manoomin production?
I mean, climate change really just affects everything in terms of like the seasonality and the growing sort of, things about it. I'm not sure exactly about the specific, like what it needs in terms of things, but I would just assume that like, the Manoomin it's like everything where it's like, it's starting to go to seed potentially earlier or later. I don't know if you've experienced that, but like our trees, it got super warm and then it got super cold. And so they dropped all their leaves and then it's like super warm again. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like our seasons are totally messed up. The Great Lakes, I think, is actually slated to be a safe haven in terms of climate catastrophe. Like I think its ecology is supposed to be like something that with climate change will be slightly better, but I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Yes, I know a lot of wealthy people have bought land in that area because I think that is set to be like, I think it's supposed to be more like the Pacific Northwest in like 30 years or something like that.
Wow. Do you know much about the activities of people like Winona LeDuc and how what they've done to raise awareness of the threat to Manoomin and just the local, as you say, the local environment generally and the threat to your lands?
Winona LeDuc has this great quote that I loved when I was first learning about her, where she went to Harvard and she got this like amazing education, and she went back and she was talking to her father and she was so proud of it. And he was just like, yeah, well, I will, like, he's like, none of that means anything if you can't grow corn. And she reflected on that and realized, he meant like, it's great that you can have all these theories and practices and you've got this education, but until you can apply it to how it affects people and, when you have that connection with the land, that is really, I've interpreted it as, you kind of really have achieved this like full holistic education and deep understanding and marrying these two things, Indigenous knowledge and this like kind of Western formal education. And I think Winona LaDuke, through her advocacy with wild rice, has really sort of embodied that practice and is able to, be on the ground and advocate for wild rice by setting up these camps, having these initiatives where people are relearning these practices, getting involved, creating an economy for her communities by being able to sell the wild rice. That's great because that's putting the money back into the community, and it's something that they can tangibly do, which is important in these like remote communities. Like I forget sometimes that, people are living in these places where there isn't a lot of necessarily work or industry. So having something like Manoomin gives people the ability to, provide for themselves, which is important. And also her advocacy work by creating different organizations. And there's other people too. But Winona is really kind of this sort of prolific figure in our community. And she has different organizations that lobby, and she has different, will go to DC and talk to people. And she also, as we mentioned before, like goes to these protests and sets up these blockades for these companies like Enbridge and corporations who are trying to drill and block and build in her communities. So I think it really requires like a multi-pronged, like holistic sort of like 360 look at like what are all the different ways we can advocate and protect for our land. Another thing that a lot of Native communities, not just the Anishinaabe, but I've been seeing in the news, which is exciting, a lot of Native communities are getting their land back or acquiring more land, which is another important piece of the puzzle, that we, do have the land back so that we can manage it again. And there's a growing movement called Land Back, which I'm not sure if you know, but it's very big in the US and Canada. It's a hashtag. It's called #LandBack. But it also embodies this idea that, on the one hand, sometimes it is literal, like give the land back. And there's people like the Cayuga Nation and different nations in California have just bought their land back, or, they were given deals where they could take traditional lands back at a discounted rate, or some just buy it outright. And also it means giving the land back as like a steward sort of way, not literally taking your farm and giving it to somebody and giving the deed back to Native people. That would be nice, but I don't think that's sustainable today. But also, that Native people have this knowledge of how to take care of the land and these foods. And it's important for them to be responsible and be able to call the shots on, this is how we're going to take care of this land. This is what we're going to do to improve the health of, these waterways, these forests. There's a big movement to kind of return the stewardship of the national park systems back to the communities that they forcibly removed from them in order to create a tourism industry and in the, sake of preserving, quote unquote, this land. So I think that's also an interesting kind of new development in this conversation as well.
That's good. Good to hear that there are some positives in this story. So, Cass, what will you bring to the season's potluck supper?
I would bring to the potluck. So when I was a kid, Manoomin was really like the only traditional food that I kind of ate because it was something that was available. And my aunts would make this thing that I still enjoy. It's kind of like a comfort food. You make the wild rice, and while it's still warm, you pour some, real maple syrup over it. So the maple syrup kind of like fills the seed and it kind of like gets in there and it's still warm. And then you add a little sea salt and berries to that. And it's something that you can have as a dessert. But I also like it as for like a breakfast. It's kind of almost like
Oh,
I don't know,
nice.
like a rice pudding porridge kind of vibe to it. But the maple syrup gives it that little bit of sweetness. And wild rice, I don't know if we got to talk about how it actually tastes, but it's like so good. It's like firm, it's a little chewy, but it's really nutty. Like it gives sort of like a walnut, sort of like
Oh, wow.
toasted vibe. So, yeah, if you think about it, it's like almost like a nutty porridge. And then you're putting this like sweet maple syrup and then these like tart berries with it. That is really good.
What berries do you
The
use?
berry just kind of depends on what I have on hand in the season. Like if I'm in the summer and I have fresh berries, like I have a lot of strawberries and blueberries that I'll put with it that I, get. I live in New Jersey and we have a lot of invasive wine berries.
Oh, don't think I know what a wineberry is.
Yes, we have a lot of them here. I have like, I don't know, maybe like 15 bushes on my property. So I will go out and harvest them. And if it's like the winter, I'll maybe use some like dried cranberries or raisins or just, what I have in the pantry and it'll sort of they'll like plump up and reconstitute if you like put them in. And sometimes a little like sliced almond in there. I don't know. You can kind of make it like an oatmeal and put what you want in it. But the like niche way is maple syrup and like blueberries or strawberries, which are like the berries that we have access to.
That sounds absolutely delightful. I'm loving the sound of this. I'm just gutted that I just don't think I can get Manoomin in the UK. So how is Manoomin used today and how is it cooked and prepared?
So Manoomin is actually one of the wild, something that is a non-cultivated food that is pretty readily available. And so it's kind of more of an accessible indigenous food if you wanted to try to eat it today. Because it is like pretty, it is something that you can kind of buy in bulk and there isn't a shortage of it. And it is quite prolific in how much it produces. So there's a few restaurants, including Owamni, which is a chef Sean Sherman's restaurant. He has a brick and mortar in Minneapolis, and he does this thing with it where he sort of puffs it. So it's like almost popped wild rice and it's puffed, and he'll put it sort of on top of certain dishes to give it's a really nutty flavor profile. So it's going to give like a nutty, crunchy vibe when it's puffed, which is really interesting. And he also does like a croquette with it and sort of like as an appetizer. And I even saw online somebody had made it into a flour and did a pasta with it, which is very interesting.
That is interesting.
It'd be like a gluten-free sort of pasta option, which would be fun. And Crystal Wapepa has also restaurant that's in Oakland, California that's called Wapepa's Kitchen. And she also does sort of like an oatmeal sort of thing. She does it where she's using it warm and adding sort of fruits and nuts and, maple syrup to kind of make something that you would have for breakfast or dessert at her restaurant too. And they both actually have cookbooks that are coming out this fall. So like any day now, which is exciting. So if you do somehow order your wild rice from, some online places that will ship internationally, I do know that, and you want to kind of like try your hand at wild rice, you can do that with their cookbooks or different recipes you can find online.
So what's next on the horizon for you?
Thankfully, I have been very busy. So this year I have been shooting, and we just wrapped production like 2 weeks ago. So that was very exciting, of a short film called Botany of Nations, which is being made in collaboration with the Academy of Sciences, which is Drexel University in Philadelphia. They have the original plant pressings from the Lewis and Clark expedition. An often little known fact that I myself did not know is that Lewis and Clark were tasked also with gathering different plants that they encountered on their expedition west, and they pressed them and asked the native communities, what do you use this plant for? Do you eat it? How do you prepare it? So they have over 500 plant pressings from the Lewis and Clark expedition from the 1820s, 1830s. And The film is decentering Lewis and Clark, recentering these Indigenous plants in the Native communities and the food practices that they have with them. So we have 3 hero plants: Timsala, which is sometimes called a prayer potato, but it is not a potato, but it does taste kind of like a potato. It's camas, which is actually the bulb of a lily that tastes like cream of wheat, if you can imagine that. That was kind of like the wild rice of the West Coast of the Pacific Northwest, in the sense that it was a extremely important trading crop and was a starch and carb that didn't spike your blood sugar. So very important trading item and community item. And Western red cedar. So that documentary should be out next year in 2026, probably in the spring, summer. So we're looking forward to releasing that, and hopefully it'll come to the UK. That would be so fun.
It would indeed. And I'm hoping that this podcast will raise awareness of it so people will go and watch it.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cass. It's been a delight talking to you today.
You as well.
Thanks again to Cass for chatting to me about Manoomin and what it means to the Anishinaabe people. You can find links to Cass's website to find out more about her work, including the new film she is working on, and Winona LaDuke's TEDx talk in the show notes. Now, I said at the beginning of this episode that I had some exciting news about the Serve It Forth Food History Festival, which was a great success, by the way. If you joined us either on the day or after the event on Catch Up, thank you so much for coming. If you weren't able to join us, fear not, as there will be another opportunity to take part in a Serve It Forth event. We will be hosting a special online festive event on Thursday the 11th of December, which will present an alternative and thoroughly creepier view of Christmas through the lens of food, folklore and tradition. I'll pop a link in the show notes so that you can find out more. The 250th anniversary of the birth of Jane Austen is coming up, so I thought it would be an ideal opportunity to look at something that preoccupied many of her characters. Join me in a couple of weeks for episode 2 of season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, when we'll be taking the waters. Comfortably Hungry was created, produced, recorded, researched and edited by Sam Bilton, with sound production and mixing by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. The music and sound effects are provided by Zapsplat.